Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us. We are very pleased to have our two representatives, Representative Chapman and Tharinger, on with us today on the EDC Coffee Chat. And they, of course, most everyone knows the legislative session ended last Thursday, and a lot was done, a lot of money was appropriated, and a lot of programs were funded, and a lot of new laws passed. So this being an economic development forum, I'm hoping we can review a lot of what was funded and what wasn't, particularly the 0.09 opportunity funds were not extended. That was Representative Tharinger's bill, I recall, from last year. Didn't quite make it over the finish line, but it was a fast and furious session. And so they are here to talk to us about that. The newsletter I sent out yesterday at about 8:15 had a lot of information in it. Of course, not everything. So I'm gonna give them the floor so they can talk about what they thought were the most impactful items of the session to Clallam County and our businesses and institutions and governments. And then we can open up the floor and talk about specific issues that people want to ask about. So quick housekeeping item, if you'll ensure your Zoom is on mute, that would be terrific. And then if you have a question, either raise your hand and I'll call on you, or you can put your question in the chat if you prefer. So thank you everybody for joining us. And which one of you wants to take it? I see Mike, you're on mute, and Steve, you're not. So Steve, you're it. Take it away.
All right, thanks, Colleen. And I have not seen your letter. As Mike said, it seemed like it was pretty comprehensive. I will just go, as folks know, I chair the Capital Budget Committee in the House. So that's the main focus of what I do every session. I'm also on the Appropriations Committee and the Health and Wellness Committee. So those are the areas I focus on. Mike and I and Kevin try to divvy up sort of the full terrain of legislative activity by focusing on different aspects. Capital budget was the most robust supplemental budget probably ever historically. So folks may know, we're in a biennial cycle. We do get elected and then we have a 2-year budget cycle. Write the major budget for the biennium the first year, and then the second year is supplemental. It sort of backfills areas that need, adjustment. But this year, because of recovery money left over from last year, and the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, IIJA, and then also dollars that came over from the operating budget, because folks may know the revenue picture for the state has been pretty robust. We had a robust capital budget of about $1.5 billion. And most of the money that came over from operating was directed towards continuing investments in housing. We have kind of a full spectrum of housing issues. We invest in the Housing Trust Fund, which packages a lot of new market tax credits to build permanent supportive housing. But we also put money into something that's called CHIP, which is Community Housing Investment Program, which builds infrastructure for sewer and water and sidewalks. A lot of the housing money builds units, but doesn't do the site preparation of the infrastructure investment. So we continued, I think over the biennium now, we've put about $70 million in that. We had 30 the last in the biennial budget. That was totally appropriated with a backlog, I think, of about 30. So that's why we beefed that up. We were able to put some money in Port Townsend, using that money to develop a site, about a 14-acre site that'll, I think, in the end have 40 to 50 housing units on it. But making investments with that money around the state. There's also money for what we call community housing, which is sort of these tiny homes and cottages to help get people out of tents, off the street and into some sort of shelter, and then move them along the spectrum to hopefully supportive housing where there's treatment, capability, and hopefully get them into a home of their own at some point. So we've been linking the capital investments with the operating budget investments. So those services are linked with the capital projects. For example, there's a daycare on the one that's being funded here in Jefferson County that the Olympic Community Action is putting together. And that's the type of linkage we're trying to create between operating and capital. The same goes for the behavioral health. That was another area where we've been putting considerable money over the last 4 or 5 bienniums since I've been capital budget chair. Again, linking the capital investments with the operating budget investments. Of course, there's workforce shortages everywhere, but we're seeing that pretty acutely in the behavioral health space. So, and there is, I think that this rapid response funding that was in housing, Peninsula Behavioral Health in Clallam County, and I think the Housing Authority were able to partner and purchase, the motel, Allview Motel, which is providing both housing and services there for folks to get them off the street and hopefully stabilize them. We put in this budget, the supplemental budget, there was $2 million for Bayview, which is our Bayside, which is, folks may know, is a organization in East Jefferson. It's a kind of an interesting model. It's the old alcohol plant hotel, and they use the revenue from the hotel to help fund supported services and provide housing. And they've got a tiny home project that's in partnership with a church, and now they're buying a motel in Hadlock, and that money's for buying the motel in Hadlock. So on the infrastructure side, we did some of this money is IIJA money, which is budgeted so that when the direction becomes clear from DC, the state will be able to spend that money. There's also dollars for, culverts in there, sewer and water. We did about $120 million for sewer and water projects around the state. And then beefed up CURB, the Community Economic Revitalization Board, which probably a lot of folks on this call are familiar with. Very nimble organization that gets money out the door, that helps with broadband, helps with sewer and water, and helps with developing sites for more economic development. Janae does a great job there. Dulek does a great job, and so we beefed that up by about $35 million. So a lot of investments in, I think, economic, long-term economic activity that will create jobs as we, make those investments, but also creates jobs in the long term. And that's kind of our focus, it was doing that. There's some money for culverts and trying, as folks may know, in the IIJA fund, there's a competitive amount of money for culverts. And so we teed up some projects to help them be, Skagit's one of those county where they have about 15 culverts that they're going to get ready to compete to fund those culverts in the IIJA money. And I'll let Mike talk. We also did money in early learning. We helped finish off an early learning facility down in Elma. And we did, again, continuing investments in broadband. Both for the state broadband office, with Public Works Assistance account, and for CURB, again, some money for broadband. Now, there was some discussion as we get into the transportation budget. Folks may know, those of you that are in local government, using the Public Works Assistance account. Since I've been chair, so I became chair of the capital budget back right when the recession hit, and that was very challenging. And the operating budget took money out of the Public Works Assistance account. And since then, we've been battling to bring that money back into the Public Works Assistance account. It has 3 revenue streams, and then it has its revolving loan fund. And at one point, the governor's budget, I think in 2010 was going to, or 2012 was just going to eliminate that. So there'd be no revenue stream and the program would die. We've been able to build that back up. So that we get the revolving loan money and part of the real estate excise tax, which is one of those funding streams. Well, the transportation budget transportation just has no revenue stream. The gas tax is down because people are driving more efficient cars. Of course, the pandemic, there was just less travel going on. So both the capital budget and the operating budget backfill the capital budget, both. And in the transportation world, there's the budget itself, which is, just a regular transportation budget, funds state patrol and ferry personnel and stuff like that. And then there's a transportation package, which is the long-term investments. So we put the money from the Public Works Fund that's going into that package, the transportation package, and which will build, and Mike is more familiar with this because he's on transportation, so I'll let him speak to it, but ferries and long-term projects. The good news is for the Public Works Fund that we are scheduled to get more of the real estate excise tax back next year. So the Public Works Fund will not see a decrease in the money they invest. What it won't see is a more robust revenue because of the revenue that we're having to dedicate to Transpo. But it's still going to be around, and it's still, from where it was, 8 years ago, it's in pretty solid shape. But I know we use that, for example, when Mike and I were commissioners, that's the funding we use to do the Carlsbrook sewer, for example. And I know Jefferson County is using it to do the Hadlock sewer project. And so we'll take another, so that's been real effective. The 0.09 that Colleen mentioned, that's the rural county sales tax that the counties get. There's 30, I think, 39 counties. I think there's like 33 or 35 of them that get that. We got it through the House with a unanimous vote, got it to the Senate, got it through all the committees. It sat in rules. The majority leader and the chair of Ways and Means Committee don't think the recording aspects of how the counties are spending that money is clear enough. They don't think the state's getting credit for that money, and they think there's a lot of variety as to way the different counties spend it. Josh Weiss, who's on the call, worked hard to get this bill to the point we got it to. And so I think jurisdictions, we're going to have to work over the interim to get jurisdictions to have a stronger reporting of how they spend the money, so that the Senate feels more comfortable about approving that, extending that. And the extension, I mean, it's still active now. The idea was to extend it so that some counties could bond against that revenue to be able to do these long-term infrastructure projects. So that's a lot of stuff, but maybe we'll get more in depth with your questions. But an historic session in a lot of ways, certainly on the budget side, both the operating budget, the capital budget, and then this to get a transportation package done in 60 days is phenomenal. But I think the transportation people have been working on it for a couple of years, so kind of a big deal. With that, I'll turn it over to Mike.
Well, I see quickly, Dr. Robbins from Peninsula College had a question in the chat about, go ahead, Luke.
Yeah, Steve, do you think that 0.9 will be back up for conversation in the next biennial session?
Yeah, we were really close on this. I mean, I was pushing for it, up till, the last hour. But when you've got majority leader and the chair of Ways and Means kind of having questions about, how the money is spent, it was just tricky. If we'd have gotten it to the floor, we had broad support for it, but it's a pretty complex game board down there in Olympia, and there's a lot of moving parts, and this just got caught up in some of that complexity.
In my conversation with Senator Rolfes last year, she had said, so there's been different discussions. Some think they should expand it to border counties as well, but so it's, I can't remember who shared with me, but it's about a $40 million bill to the state that it's pulled away and from state revenues. And if it is extended to border counties, then that's an additional 20 million, which Senator Rolfus said she was not supportive of. So that's, I think, why you just kept it as is. But then, you don't have as much support if a representative's district isn't going to be getting any of that funding.
Yeah, I don't, that came up last year a little bit, but it wasn't really the issue this year. I mean, I think you're right. It would obviously cost the state more. The way the legislation's written originally is you need to have a capital facilities plan, and how you invest this money has to be linked to that capital facilities plan. And different counties do that differently, of course, and then there is a reporting function to the Secretary of State. But for some reason, the majority leader had done this work a few years ago, and he's from Spokane, and he didn't feel Spokane was meeting those requirements, as other counties weren't meeting those requirements. And Josh and I worked on that and tried to get language. In fact, we took an amendment that tightened that language. So I think just in the interim, we're just going to have to work with all the different counties to have them have a clearer reporting and do that work if they want to see this extended. And I think we certainly want to see it extended because it's a very useful tool for us up here. Both Clallam and Jefferson counties use it, as does Grace Harbor. So we just got to get the reporting function, I think, so it's clearer to those folks that have questions about that. And I see Josh has his hands up. He might have some background also.
Thank you, Representative Tharinger, for all your work on this. And I'm sorry I can't be on video. I'm just in a bad cell phone area, and just want to say thanks to a couple of great legislators for all your work that you do. We did, actually you did, get in the budget as well relative to 0.09, a requirement that the state auditor's office summarize the annual reports that they get from counties now and put it on a web-based reporting system. So as long as the governor doesn't veto that proviso out, we will have a better foundation next year with this new web-based reporting platform for this kind of data. So I'm really hopeful that that gets us across the line, and just again, very appreciative of Representative Tharinger and Representative Chapman for all your work. So thanks. Sorry I can't be really on the call.
Thanks, Josh. So, and also just since we're on the 0.09 topic, there was the bill that expands the use of 0.09 funds for affordable housing. And I know a lot of entities, including the Port of Port Townsend, are concerned that that will just sweep that for that cause, because it is such an enormous need. And there are, few sources of funding for economic development infrastructure projects. But we'll see how that goes. And I know in Island County, they anticipate that their EDC there will no longer get any funding because that their 0.09 funds, their opportunity funds, will go to housing. So it's, the housing situation is really changing our local economies and how funding streams are working. So
yeah, and just to comment on that, I wasn't opposed to the housing piece because I think it builds support for the program, actually. And again, these are local decisions on how that money is going to be spent, so the community gets to prioritize. I mean, obviously, there could be pressure locally for the housing component, but it builds support for that 0.09 to have that additional capability. But again, the locals could decide whether that's their priority. And there are other funding streams, of course, for housing through the Housing Trust Fund and some of these other programs I mentioned.
yes. All right. Thank you very much, Representative Tharinger. And Representative Chapman, do you want to take it?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks everyone for being here. I'll keep it short just so we can get to questions real quick. I guess, for me, I think this session, Steve did a pretty good job, and Colleen, you did a great job of kind of highlighting, the spending. And I think there's more to legislation than just spending. I think there's more to our work than just spending, but that gets the headlines, and certainly is significant investments. I'm glad to see that, we were able to secure some funding for the Sequim to Blinn corridor improvement project, money for ferries, trying to get the ferry workforce issue taken care of. So there's some training dollars for various workforce issues, including for nurses. I think, for me, if I just said, well, what was the highlight? It's an issue that I've supported, worked on, sponsored in the past, and was okay to see that it takes a retiring key senator to get the bill across finally, but it really was the elimination, basically for all intents purposes, the elimination of the B&O on our smallest of businesses, an issue that's kind of bothered a lot of folks. And the argument over whether Washington should have an income tax or not. I've always said if you're a sole proprietor and you bring in $90,000 a year and you pay a B&O tax, we just taxed your income. And we didn't let you write off any expenses. It's just a tax. And so for small businesses making up to about 125,000 starting next year, that there'll be no B&O tax collected, and the credit continues on up to about 250,000. I would argue in these, economic times, we're seeing more and more people move to the peninsula who are sole proprietors, and we're seeing a lot of folks that have had to leave the workforce for various reasons that have become sole proprietors. And many of them, a number of months ago, I had a plumber in my house, and we were chatting, and this issue came up, and he's like, "Yeah, I generate about 115,000 a year. I don't work, I don't take as many jobs as I'm just repair. I'm just bumping around repair, and I'm happy." And he says, "Yeah, it's an annoying tax." And so if I think of my friend Will, now he won't have to worry about filing that every quarter. And I think it's one of those things. There's been a lot of argument that somehow the legislature, just spent and didn't cut taxes. And I'm going to argue, I think cutting B&O tax for small businesses is a significant tax cut, and it is a significant loss of revenue down the road. But I think it was the right thing to do, and really a highlight for me and for many of my colleagues. And thanks to Senator Reuven Carlisle for retiring, because he sponsored it and was able to get it through the Senate. Because I think that was an issue that we passed a couple of versions off the House floor that I had sponsored in years past, and then it would go to the Senate and just struggle over there. So with that, I think Steve covered some of the highlights on, and we just want to get to your questions, but sometimes legislation isn't always about what does pass. Sometimes there are things, I know there's a number of bills that people might bring up that like, wow, why didn't that pass? But I'm going to say for every bill that maybe this group is upset that didn't pass, I can probably give you 2 bills that you wouldn't have liked to see pass that didn't pass as well. So it works both ways, right? I mean, you don't get everything you want from a small business economic development perspective, but I can guarantee you there are a lot of labor bills and a lot of trial lawyer bills, a couple of key ones that didn't pass. And there's a lot of frustration among those groups. Obviously the nurse staffing bill that OMC and some of the medical community was most upset about, that was priority bill number 1 for labor. And also the interest for local governments and for lawsuits, private right of actions. The trial lawyers wanted to start the interest clock from the time of the event, not from the time of when they're found guilty. And that interest was really going to probably hurt a lot of local governments. And that bill was heavily, it was looked at hard and debated, and it just didn't have the votes to move forward. So sometimes it's not about what we do pass. Sometimes it is bills that would have maybe hurt, caused some other issues to rise up. And there's the Ergonomics Bill that we debated all night long. I think some of you, I got an email from me at 2 or 3 or 4 in the morning when we were debating the repeal of the initiative around ergonomics, though it passed the House, I think by 1 vote after about a 9.5, 10-hour debate. It didn't pass the Senate. And I think it was the fact that it only passed the House with 1 vote or so, and that it was a long debate. And you have to kind of look at those issues, and the Senate didn't move that. And that was probably priority bill number 2 for organized labor. So folks may be upset again today about bills we didn't pass, but all in all, I think it was a balanced approach on all of these issues. And, they're all issues that'll come back in some form or another. And we'll, the next, it'll be debated in the legislature next time. So with that, let's get some questions.
What was that ergonomics bill you were talking about? What would it do?
It would have repealed the initiative that was adopted, I think, in 2006. So there was a period where small businesses were having to make all these accommodations around ergonomics and make sure people didn't sit in one place. And there was a whole suite of bills, and the voters repealed basically most of them. This bill would have repealed the initiative and given kind of carte blanche authority to the Department of Labor and Industries to rewrite ergonomics rules across the board with basically the legislature was going to outsource reestablishing major and I'm not an expert on these issues. I would imagine Jennifer probably has some thoughts on this bill too, but it would have basically, we would have seen significant new regulations on an issue. Now, that was an interesting debate. If you ever want to have 9.5 hours you want to burn and really learn about how your government works and what, there are two debates you should really pull up on TVW. The one is on ergonomics. The other was on the large capacity magazines. There were some interesting comments made on that bill as well. And I think, I do wish people would, I think the public should be educated on these debates and really educated on what the two different competing ideas are on these issues. Again, if you have
I think Mike does a really good job, but I don't think that's really good advice. I would not spend that time on TVW watching, two debates that lasted about 8 hours. You could maybe get a flavor in about 20 minutes as to what was going on. But I do want to mention, Colleen, we didn't talk much about the operating budget, which was also historically robust for a supplemental. And I see Wendy Siska's on the call, and I think over the combination of what we put in, in the biennial budget and the supplemental budget, there's about $1 billion for behavioral health, for increased, wages and funding for staffing, and non-Medicaid services, which is a real challenge for Wendy and other folks like her, because that's sort of a gap in the funding. So again, this is trying to, behavioral health is a huge issue, right? That impacts a lot, and it's pretty acute these days. I think the COVID has accentuated that need. But and I guess this is the debate, right? So you're going to hear a lot of folks say, well, we should have given a tax break, and we should have maybe sprinkled money around, to individuals. But when we have needs around behavioral health in our schools that have been impacted by the COVID, I think these targeted investments actually make a bigger difference in our communities than $25 in somebody's wallet. So, and as Mike mentioned, we did do the B&O tax, break for small businesses, and I think that's a big deal. But I think making investments in behavioral health, and in another area that's important up here on the peninsula is long-term care. We've just had real gaps, right, in the people that are providing care in long-term care facilities, or individuals that are caring, in people's homes. And so we really filled those gaps, as I mentioned, about $1 billion in behavioral health for the biennium, and $2.4 billion to catch up on long-term care and developmental disability services. And I think those kind of investments just make our community stronger and create, stabilize that workforce, which is doing such important work in our communities. So I just wanted to highlight that.
All right. Thank you. So I see that Chair Allen had a question. Would you like to ask about the biochar legislation?
Yeah, I don't know if Steve or Mike know about it, but I just want to note to both of you guys that our tribe has been working with Herman Brothers and a company called Mino down in Bainbridge on a biochar project. So I didn't know if this was it looked like it was a specific project, or if it's biochar development in general.
Yeah, I don't think it was a specific project, Ron. I think it's more just development in general to highlight it.
Okay.
It does say that it is DNR will work on a pilot project on the Olympic Peninsula. So I know there's a biochar project in Okanagan County that actually received some funding in the operating budget, about $80,000, if I remember correctly. But this was directing DNR to work on a pilot project on the Olympic Peninsula to create, to source for biochar, but it didn't attribute any funding to it. So what I understand is that it had been more directive initially, and then that was stripped.
So you're saying that DNR is going to administer this program?
I will send you the email I received on it, Ron.
Okay,
And
fair enough.
so all I know is what that email said. So.
All right. Well, this is a big project. It's a problem solver on climate change impacts on forestry practices, and I think many of you know what biochar does and why it's a big value. Just hasn't been developed the way it can be, but it's expensive. I'll tell you. At first, when I first got into it, I thought I was talking 50 million. Turns out it's 200 million. So, Steve, I'm coming back at you.
Yeah, we're talking real money, Ron. We're starting to talk some real money all of a sudden here.
Yeah.
I think
I'm
this
just
bill
kidding.
I think this bill's a little more, it's a requirement for the state and local governments. It's a requirement to determine whether specific biochar products can be used when planning government funded projects that are public works and or soliciting and letting contracts. So it's creating a market, an on-demand market right out of the gate. We can't require the private sector to do this, but we're going to be requiring state and local agencies to look at whether biochar should be used. And it's got some amazing uses, not only to trap the carbon, obviously, that has been stored, but also has some great uses in public works projects around sewage treatment plants and that sort of thing. So I think this bill is a little more robust than just, hey, we all like biochar, go forth and create an industry. We're actually requiring local governments to start looking at it in their planning. And I think that's going to drive, in talking with the folks from Bainbridge Island who have partnered with you, Ron, I mean, this was their bill. This was the bill that was like, this is going to put us in business, keep us in business. They were all in on it, and they thought this was a really important piece of legislation for this new industry.
Well, that's good to know. Okay, I'll follow up on it in terms of what it's actually doing, and we're working with Mino on some grant applications with ag and energy. So, but we think it's a big deal for the Olympic Peninsula, and it really shows a model that works. Quite frankly, I'm pretty excited about this project. So, and I just want to say also, for a minute, Colleen, I want to chime in on the compliment. You guys did a great job, and it was hard to do what you did in this short session. So, for those of us who have to work long and short sessions, it's a real lesson in what you can do in a short session. So, going to our Lorraine Loomis riparian zone, we'll circle back to you, Mike and Steve, on it, working with our ag industry and others who have concerns about that objective. So thank you. I appreciate your guys' patience and leadership.
Thanks,
Yeah,
Ron.
I want to reiterate what Chair Allen said there. That would be a huge investment in Clallam County. We're very excited that biochar has chosen Clallam County, and it's in the Port Angeles area. So that, and Thor said at least 50 jobs, but there's so many downstream benefits too. So it's exciting. I saw Mark Lane had a question. Mark, do you want to pose that? The CFO of the county? Sure.
Good morning, everyone. My question was really kind of piggybacking an earlier discussion regarding affordable housing. Our county is in the process right now. Our commissioners has decided to move forward with implementing the 0.1 HB 1590 sales tax in support of affordable housing projects. Port Angeles has already implemented this tax, and as we're looking at bringing the available sources of funding to bear on affordable housing. And as somebody pointed out, certainly the problem we all recognize is far larger than the funding that is available through these various taxes and grants and ARP allocations and such. But one of the areas that certainly would be helpful for our county, as well as many others that are impacted by the current state prevailing wage rules as it relates to funding of projects, is I was just curious from either one of the representatives whether there has been any discussion regarding potential exemption from these prevailing wage requirements in support that are incurred in support of constructing affordable housing. Again, we're trying to look at it from the standpoint of making our buck go as far as we possibly can. And certainly when we're kind of saddled with paying for these projects based upon a prevailing wage in a part of the state that is arguably the not even arguably is one of the most expensive areas to be metriced against. I was just curious as to whether any legislation has been discussed regarding getting possible relief from that requirement, at least as it relates to affordable housing projects.
Yeah, I mean, there has been some discussion. So the housing itself, so I mentioned earlier this Olympic Community Action Project in Port Townsend, I think it's called Seventh Haven actually. And they have the housing piece, I think, is exempt, but they have a daycare center that's part of this facility that is not exempt. And so they're working on that. I've had some discussions. There's no specific legislation that I know of. Mike may know if something, but there was discussion, I think, either last year or the year before about, that challenge that you mentioned, Mark, about this creates problems about the affordability of the housing. So I think the housing projects themselves can have some exemptions, but if you incorporate some of the other services within that structure, then there's some challenges. But I think there's some workarounds for that, but it's not clear, and it is a challenge, but it's on people's screens, and there is conversation around that. Mike may know more, having been on the Labor Committee before.
Like this was an issue. Yeah, I was on the Labor Committee, and the chair of the Labor Committee who served there, 18 years. I mean, this just wasn't gonna, these kind of bills were just not going to move. He retired, and I've talked with the new incoming chair. She's much more sensitive to housing and pricing from the district that she represents. Although she's in the Seattle area, she has seen some of this. So she would like to. I think there's a couple of housing advocates in Olympia, and when I've chatted with both of them, this issue's come up, and they would like to look at it as a project by project basis, possibly. I don't think you're going to see a blanket rule on this, but you might begin to look at if there's significant state investments, probably not as great, but if it's more local investments, they may look at trying to relax some of this. It's a tough issue. Again, labor is going to fight it tooth and nail. It's a priority for labor to keep these wages on the books.
Okay. Well, thank you. Again, and certainly, and that I'm sure you guys, both you gentlemen, can appreciate too. But the challenges coupled with just the supply chain issues relating just to cost of materials, where a piece of plywood, that goes into building a roof, has gone from $18 a sheet to almost $100 a sheet in certain situations. That coupled with complying with the prevailing wage requirements really puts a damper on how much we're able to accomplish. I look at one of the a group home that one of our organizations out in Forks just completed for homeless veterans, Whole Bucket House project. Basically it's a modular home, but because of all the costs relating to that, I mean, it was well over $1.3 million construction cost. And so when you look at something like that relative to what it would cost without those types of requirements, it's a sobering problem that we have. So.
I appreciate that. I would also argue, and I've spent some time on some construction projects around the district where the Carpenters Union is the lead supplier of labor. I'm going to be honest, everybody's going to be paying these wages right now because they can't find the workers they need so in some respects, this argument's probably about 4 years old, because the reality is the private sector and the carpenter, the private sector is filling in when the Carpenters Union don't have enough laborers and everybody's making the same wage. So on one hand, maybe you're right, but on the other hand, going forward with where labor's at and where labor's going to stay, this is not the time where people aren't already paying. Look, we used to be debating whether we should have a $15 minimum wage. Well, who's hiring at $15 an hour right now? I mean, that kind of, we blew through that in no hurry. And the reality is, looking forward, that's not going to change. The labor's tight. We've had a great, we can get into this. We have a whole program on labor, but the script is flipped. 4 years ago, we needed jobs. Now we need workers, and that means higher wages. So.
Well, you're not always seeing that. I know my son, who's 21, he gets paid $16 an hour and he's working his tail off in the construction industry. So there's still, a lot lower wages out there. But I see Wendy's got her hand up. Wendy?
I just wanted to comment. So, we've taken on this big housing project with the Allview Motel. And so this is somewhat new to me. And I do see an increase in somewhat what we're paying around the residential prevailing wage, but you're right, Mike, that gap is smaller than it used to be in terms of prevailing wage, if you're talking about residential prevailing wage. So the other issue that's really driving up costs of developing affordable housing is if we're accepting money from the state, these evergreen sustainable design standards that have been put in place. And this was new to me. I didn't know this was a thing. And for those of you who don't know it, you're welcome to look at the 300-page manual that dictates some of the requirements for green building standards when you're building new construction with housing trust fund dollars. Mark mentioned the 1590 funds. And I think as a community, part of what we're hoping to do is leverage those funds to help us bring in more state funds to expand that affordable housing. But the evergreen sustainable design standards dramatically increase the cost of building when we've already enhanced our international building standards that we're building from. And so again, that's an area that I would love for the state to go back and say, look, we are in a housing crisis. So why are we creating additional costs and barriers to putting quality housing on the market? If you're building at current building standards, then you're actually building a quality product. So, I don't know where that came from, Steve. I don't know how that got built out and developed, but that is dramatically driving up the cost. And if we could reduce that cost, then we could build more housing with the existing dollars that we have.
Yeah, I mean, Mike mentioned some of the things that didn't happen, and there's been a bill floating around this biennium to actually increase that, not the requirements, it's reporting what materials and stuff you're using. This relates to climate change, Wendy, and there's folks that are really concerned about that and the energy costs and the carbon that's used to create that energy. So this is what's driving
I get
that.
it, Steve,
and
but
I guess
people are living on our streets across the
I
state, and it's
I
not
think
as pronounced here as elsewhere.
Yeah, but I think that's the long-term consideration for that drives a lot of that policy. So it's tough politically. I don't disagree with you, but it's there's an interest to get, to make our buildings more efficient.
I hear you. And again, current building standards, I think really meet a lot of that. It's pretty hard to build an inefficient building at this point and get that, through all your permitting process and inspections. And I would just love for us to, I know we want to get upstream of problems, But if we continue to let people drown on the way there, it's not helpful. And in a community like ours, resources are really limited. There's only so much we can ask this community to do. And so, if we can extend our dollars, I think that there's absolutely value in that, because we're probably building, a third less housing than we could with the resources that we've got, if we could get some of this regulatory stuff out of the way.
Well, if you want to give me some specifics on that, but I'm just telling you, it's pretty hard sledding probably.
Yep. Thanks, Steve.
One of the, look, I think you should know what the argument is in Olympia. It's not just that we agree and we can't do anything. The argument is, and a majority of legislators buy this argument, that upfront investments in housing and that sort of thing, the upfront investment is actually going to make the housing more affordable through the energy savings down the road, especially in a time of high inflation and rising energy costs. And so that's the prevailing attitude with the argument, the debate. It occurs. There are those who raise the issue of, and again, some of these debates are played out on the House floor. There are those who say you're raising the upfront costs and that's driving of housing more affordable, more unaffordable. And others who are saying with rising energy costs, for as far as now the eye potentially can see, that we're actually making housing more affordable on a sustainable long-term basis. And it is really the same argument that automakers made 30, 40 years ago when they said, you want us to raise our CAFE standards? That's going to add so much to the price of a car. But look, what's the hottest car to buy right now? It's either a hybrid or an electric. Why? Because gas is pushing $5 a gallon for the foreseeable future. I mean, people are paying whatever. So I don't know, Wendy, but that's the argument. That is the countervailing argument of affordable housing, is what is the sustainable cost of that housing? And I think that's an issue that we never talk about enough. We just say, if we make it affordable to build, it's affordable forever. But if it's leaking, if it's not as efficient, plus you have a bureaucracy called the State Building Code Council who looks at these. We also had a bill that didn't pass, like Steve said, and it was going to give every jurisdiction in the state the authority to put a more restrictive energy code in place. Can you imagine if you were a builder that operated across multiple jurisdictional lines and tried to follow it? And that bill didn't move. So there was some pushback. But that's the argument.
I feel compelled to bring up the other fact. In 2018, when the legislature passed the bill that said all prevailing wages are set by a union collective bargaining agreement. And so the union's geographies, are King County, Kitsap, Clallam, and Jefferson. How did we get in with King counties? And so they eliminated the due local survey. And so that substantially raised our prevailing wages out here. And, it's good that that has been an issue that I see that I think is particular to rural areas. And the other thing that's really frustrating is I want to see copies of these collective bargaining agreements that set our wages in our county, and it's opaque. We can't get them. LNI said, no, can't give those to you. Those are, the unions. Talk to the union. Mark Riker, he said, no, the unions don't like to provide those. So that just seems, astonishing to me that all of our counties' prevailing wage rates that we have to pay are set by these collective union bargaining agreements that we can't get copies of to know what is that boundary and how did they set that.
So when some of these bills are being lobbied and I'm getting pounded on by the labor unions to support them, I remind them of these other pieces of legislation that they have codified, and it allows us to push back. And I believe that's why so many of these labor bills that would have been even more draconian just didn't move. Too many of us are saying, you've already passed significant legislation in the recent years. Let's digest those as a state. But we do have a strong labor movement in this state. We have strong labor unions, and we want, I think, most of us on this call want to see good paying labor jobs. And so you can't tell the unions, no, we're not going to give you anything more. And we're going to take away key beliefs that they've worked for years. So I get it. You know what? We push back. We stopped priority labor bills, but prevailing wage and some of these other pieces of legislation were used by some of us when the labor unions were lobbying us hard. And I guess that's called the art of compromise. You don't get everything you want every year. And it seems to me that right now, lack of labor, not what we're charging for it, seems to be the issue, but I could be wrong. That's just what I'm being told.
So Jim Stoffer had a question or point he wanted to make.
Yes, thank you. I just want to thank Mike and Steve for their work on through this whole session. You mentioned about, not everything gets through, but you don't sit on the education committees, but actually you do with between apportionment and the rural agriculture ones. And this session was so focused, and I thank you for answering the 500 emails that I sent you. I really appreciate that. You mentioned, Mike, it's 5155, which was that interest bill, which would have been detrimental to school districts. And so thank you for, I'm glad it did not pass. And, but we got 5017, which was a funding mechanism for districts. The seismic bill went through. There's the budget proviso on wildland fires, which that funding won't come out of the DNR administrative cost, which keeps it in the beneficiaries accounts. And so I just thank you for your work this session. And this ad was not paid for by your campaigns, but thank you for your work. And I know, I watched a lot of those TVW debates long into the night, because we're highly interested on which bills are going to move on and then move on to be for a signature. So thank you.
So we only have 6 minutes remaining, and I think we covered most of the topics here. But one thing I wanted to bring up is the controversy around the transportation budget and how it wasn't a partisan discussion, apparently. And so that there, there's a disagreement about, whether there were no new gas taxes. I wrote that in the newsletter I sent out, but then, other people interpret the Climate Commitment Act, the cap and trade, is essentially an increase, a gas tax. But where the funding occurred was, can you speak to that districts that were represented by Republicans received far fewer amounts? That's the claim I've been hearing about and what I've been getting emails on. Can you speak to that and the process, and what's your comment there?
Well, serving on the Transportation Committee, I got an upfront and close look, and I'm not whether members around the state feel like they didn't get, look, I didn't get some projects that I put into. I want to remind everyone, Jake Fye, who chairs the House Transportation Committee, is a graduate of Port Angeles High School and grew up in Port Angeles and has a road west of Port Angeles named after his family. So he certainly knows the area. He's been a great partner for me to get some projects through, but we didn't get everything we wanted. As far as the fact that for the first time, the transportation budget was a partisan vote, I saw Jake work with the ranking member, show tremendous patience. For a couple of years, we've been talking about a full transportation package, and what we heard from our friends across the aisle was no new gas tax. So that was taken off the table. Then we came up with an idea of trying to maybe tax exports. Washington actually we create more, we have a refining capacity for gasoline than we use, so we export it. And that became a political problem for some of our members on the border states. And so the export gas tax went away. We finally, pulled some money out of operating, pulled some money out of capital, and pulled some money that was going to go back into the Public Works Trust Fund to fund a $17 billion transportation package. Last year, we did pass the Climate Commitment Act, and certainly there are there's some carbon dollars that are going to be used in the transportation package. We also passed the low carbon fuel standard last year. All of those were partisan votes. And on the low carbon fuel standard, I'll just say I'm being proven to be right, because they said it wouldn't be more expensive than diesel, and it's not. And it's such a great, we had the REG, the largest biodiesel manufacturer. They had a huge plant in the southern end of our legislative district, and they are operating at such a high efficiency. And so look, Chevron just bought them. And so Chevron in their move to more sustainable fuels, more biofuels, literally bought the largest manufacturer of biodiesel in the United States, so we now have a Chevron plant in our district. They're operating at a much lower rate than today's diesel prices. So I think all in all, no new gas tax, no new export tax, generally live within our means. And finally, I'd add, and Steve knows this, there'll also be a lot of complaints that somehow we spent all the money, there's no more rainy day fund. The rainy day fund will be larger than it's ever been, and it's projected to be 22% of state revenue after this biennium, which is a historic rainy day fund. So some of these are just kind of the tired partisan outlook. And I'll just say that it's a tired argument. There were Republican amendments taken on operating budget. There were Republican amendments taken on the capital budget. There were Republican amendments taken on the transportation, but 2 or 3 of those budgets were partisan votes. So be it. It is what it is. And it's just the process we live under. Go ahead, Steve.
Yeah, I work with Chair Phi quite a bit, because this session, our operating budget, capital budget, transportation budget were more linked and woven together than I'd ever seen before. And, I asked him that question. I said, ours, because we are very, are concerned they didn't get a voice. But he said early on, and he's been working on this for 2 solid years and had over 167 meetings across the state with different stakeholders. But when and those were bipartisan. And then when they started to figure out, get down to the language of the budget, the package this year, Republicans said no new revenue. And so they just left the room. And you can't negotiate with someone who just says, you're going to fund a $17 billion package and there's no new revenue. I mean, that doesn't work, right? So I think there's some ideological disabilities there that are, leading to them not being able to participate. That's their choice. And they'll make a political message there, and that's the way it works. So, but I think that the process, as far as statewide, they met around the state, at 167 meetings with a number of stakeholders for the last couple of years. That's a lot of process with a lot of input from a lot of people. So, and as far as the projects being in, Eastern Washington or Western Washington, I mean, just do the numbers, right? King County is bigger than the rest of anything east of the Cascades. So, and they're funding most of these projects, right? So, we do well if you consider the amount of dollars we put in, the amount of dollars we get back. I think speaks to Mike's ability to get our projects through that transportation process. So it's a complex game board. I'll just tell you that. There's a lot of different levels with a lot of different aspects to it, and there's a lot of posturing. Let's be frank.
All right. Let's see, a couple new things in here. So Debbie, I saw you had some specific questions about some Senate bills. Did you want to ask that? Maybe
those are the transportation funding pack bills. I
Right.
assume she's just assuming. I assume that it's about the how we funded it and how much that's going to cost people.
Especially in rural areas. I mean, anybody outside of the I-5 corridor is going to be paying a whole lot more.
I don't know about that. Actually, our gas is pretty expensive compared to Seattle. I don't know that we're creating jobs by creating a market for biofuels. I don't know why that's not. I'm surprised that I have been surprised at the pushback over my support for REG and biofuels in my district. I get it everywhere I go. Everybody hates that product and hates that company and hates that we require that we now use it in our state when it creates 65 really good paying jobs in Grace Harbor County. And I'll have that debate any place, anytime. This is a great product and a great company, so good that a major oil company bought them at a premium over their stock price. But I am still that one surprises me at the pushback I get in the 24th for support, both from the left and the right. It's not just Republicans who push back. The far left hasn't liked that either. So I don't know about that one. That one has really caused me great distress.
Well, let's see, it is 9:03, so I think we will call this a morning. But before we go, I just want to extend my extreme appreciation for the hard work that both of you do on behalf of your district. And I know it's fast and furious during session, but this is a year-long job so that you understand what the issues are at the throughout your district. And it's a big geographical district that grew just in the last redistricting process. So thank you for everything you do. And of course, I know you'll be there at the annual gala that we're hosting on Friday. So that's sold out and oversold. So I'm trying to undo some tickets. But we really appreciate your attendance today and on Friday. So thank you, everyone.
And
Thanks for joining us today.
soon.
Thanks, Colleen. Thanks for all you do and bringing this together. So.